but we'll give half an hour now to Theresa and Gohar, who will be talking to us about evidential strategies in ancient versus early modern medical discourse. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for having us. We're bringing up evidential strategies today, which fit in the bigger picture of efficacy strategies we heard already yesterday about in several talks. And we do so in a quite exploratory way as we try to bring together our different perspectives and interests as a diachronic corpus linguist of German in Gohar's case and Indo-Europeanist in my case. So this is very much work in progress and exploration for us all, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we should mention that we're coming from a very specific context. So we're working in a collaborative research center focusing on register studies from 15 different perspectives, and the perspective is the historical one. So in register studies, it is always advisable to have a look around at the context of language, of the linguistic structures, and we're doing this by using the this model from Halliday, who tries to connect different systems on the extra-linguistic side and the linguistic side. So first of all, we will have a look on the extra-linguistic system, so the socio-historical context of ancient and German vernacular scientific communication. Then we try to deduce the importance of the linguistic function of evidentiality in this particular context. Then we're looking at a certain instantiation of the socio-historical context, namely the communication in the ancient and the German vernacular. Here, the corpus of the German vernacular comes into play, and our results will be again in the linguistic side. So how is this function of evidentiality realized and instantiated in our corpus regarding the context of the socio-historical background? So,
yeah, starting out with the socio-historical context, I like to say that in evaluating epistemological accounts of medical discourse in a diachronic perspective, one can reveal different traditions of knowledge located in different periods or stages of these discourses. So starting out in antiquity, we took Galen as one of the most prolific intellectuals of Western antiquity as one prominent representative of medical discourse from the imperial period. And in his treatise, we find epistemological meta information pointing to a contrast, but also a balance between traditional, written, academic, learned knowledge and practical knowledge on the other side that are both required for successful diagnosis and prognosis, so says Galen herself. During the Middle Ages, anchored in the scholastic tradition, epistemological reference is made exclusively to classical authorities, which shows. Oh, thank you. So this shows that learned knowledge has been conceived as the only reliable source of evidence during that period. And for early modern medical texts and scientific texts in that time in general, it has been already observed, for example, by Richard Witt, whom we cite here, that the importance of self-established, self-experienced knowledge steadily increases, and that the theoretical and practical knowledge traditions reconnect during that period. So before 1600, the Latin-dominated academic and the practical knowledge, on the other hand, had been completely detached, at least for the German discourse. And Leonhard Fuchs refers to that in a programmatic way in the prologue of his Neues Kräuterbuch, cited on this side. So he says, a few years ago, the knowledge of almost all herbs was so completely extinguished among the majority of the physicians and came to such a great decline that few physicians were found who were able to correctly and thoroughly recognize even just 10 herbs. And they thought it was the business of the old women and unlearned pharmacists who stored that practical knowledge. So taking that background and coming to evidentiality as a linguistic category, one can say with Diewald and Smirnova, for example, that the basic characteristic of linguistic evidentiality is the explicit encoding of a source of information or knowledge, that is the evidence, which the speaker claims to have made use of for producing the primary proposition of the utterance. So you use evidentials as an information about the fact you claim, the fact that is the main proposition of your utterance. And evidential marking, in a narrow sense, comprises obligatory marking of evidence types through grammatical means. So by verbal endings, for example, as you see in these forms of Tucano, an American language. And this kind of evidential marking is very, very common in American and Australian languages, but not so much for Indo-European languages, say, which is why it makes sense to conceive evidentiality in a broader sense, to be able to look at a variety of strategies on different levels of language, be it either sentence adverbs like obviously, evidently, or modal verbs like in the German example, er soll ein guter Schauspieler sein. He's said to be, he allegedly is a good actor. So this conception of evidentiality makes it more easy to compare evidential concepts also in different languages and to take that cross-linguistic account on it. The typology of evidentials that we made use of, and that is very widespread, goes back to Willett in 1988. He distinguished between the following types of information source. So first, on the left-hand side, you see the direct or attested through visual, auditory, or other sensory means evidence. And on the left-hand side, we have, on the right-hand side, sorry, we have indirect information sources, which comprises two subcategories, that of inference from results or reasoning on the one hand, and that of reported or hearsay evidence on the other hand, which includes also second-hand, third-hand, or folklore as specific types of evidence. And taking that, we're going to have a quick look at our methodological approach. And for this paper, for this study, we combined qualitative and quantitative methods in, yes, as I said, a really exploratory way, starting out with a close reading of two of Galen's most influential treatises, De Sanitate Tuenda and De Locis Affectis, and evaluating there the evidential strategies that Galen makes use of. Our observations from that, together with Willett's typological categories, build the basis for our annotation of evidentials in the richest corpus that Gohar is going to introduce to you in a minute. And then we searched the corpus and tried to get an idea of which questions and perspectives might be fruitful for our interests, complementing that with close reading. So also there we have that qualitative part of our research. And Galen treats epistemology and logic really explicitly in his philosophical texts, but he refers to them also in his medical treatises, focusing there on evidence as a condition for right and successful diagnosis and prognosis of illnesses. As a main source of knowledge in these areas, he defines apodeixis, that is demonstration, practical demonstration. And the premises used for apodeixis must consist, says Galen, of propositions of evident truth, and this evidence can be provided either through logical reasoning or referring to one's own sense perception. And to show you that in two examples, accordingly, the linguistic strategies of evidentials refer either to sense perception, that is direct evidence in Willett's terms, and we find that in the first example, we have also seen clearly, so the D we use for annotating the direct evidence, and on the other hand, we find logical reasoning as indirect or referred evidence, in the following sentence of the first example, this being an obvious sign. So here, indirect and logical reasoning comes into play. And on the other hand, we show that in the second example on the slide, we have reference to authorities of the field, and that would be indirect reported evidence, as here has also been shown by Hippocrates when he says as follows. So that would be a typical case of reported evidence.
Okay, coming from ancient Greek to early modern period in German-speaking countries. So I could tell you a lot of things about the Regis corpus because it is one of my corpus children co-parenting, but I focus to the most important ones. The Regis corpus, Register and Diachronic German Science corpus, was a corpus attempt to design a corpus or a resource for tracing down register developments, which is of course very difficult. And it is even more difficult because the German vernacular scientific discourse isn't even really scientific, because the Latin was very dominating in this time till the 19th century. And therefore the text population is really difficult to grasp. And we decided to take a stable parameter of topic, because most of the near scientific texts were focusing on herbs. So the inclusion criteria were, we included printed text of 30 pages each, so extracts from those texts, main text as well as prologues if available, and all the texts should somehow feature herbs, and of course they were also featuring other topics. So on this visualization, so the portrait, you can say, of the corpus, you can see the different text extracts. The colors are the topic or the topic combinations. So for example, blue is botanical, medical. We have also really mixed topics with alchemy, gardening, cooking, and all at once in one text. And the items are the different chapter types. So the dots are the main text and the snowflakes are the prologues. And as you can see, the texts are really differing in text length in lemma tokens. So the y-axis is indicating the text length. And this corpus resource we enriched by an annotation of evidential types. So the types Theresa already introduced. One example for a direct evidential would be every day I see and observe that the farmer during his work pays attention to the sun, and so the author himself observed something, had direct evidence to this fact. For reported evidence, it would be Dioscurides writes that wormwood from Pontus and Cappadocia is the best. This is the most common type, as we will see in the earlier period, and logically inferred. But I know from practice and experience that this route is a valuable sweat-inducing route, so it is something deduced from observances and stated as a fact. Okay, so this was the basis for the results, but I have to say here again that we don't take the numbers as the deliverers of truth, so to say, but rather as indices for getting a chance to get more informed hypothesis of what might be interesting to look at. So coming back to our research question, we asked ourselves, with the use of the corpus, does the high prestige of the ancient medical discourse in the early modern period show reflexes with regard to the strategy and form of evidentials in the scientific or pre-scientific, we have to say, texts on herbology? And first of all, we thought it might be interesting to look at whether and how much evidentials were even used in the texts. So we have texts differing in length, as I said, so it is not an easy task to look at it, but we tried to approach this by looking at proportions of evidentials in the context of the text length and grouping the text by their amount of evidentials contained. So the first observation was that we have a range from 0 evidentials to 295 evidentials, and the amount of evidentials, so the absolute count of evidential, does not correlate with text length. So we have really large texts with very few evidentials and the other way around. So I grouped the text regarding the amount of evidentials in the first quarter, so to say. There are texts with very few evidentials, and in the fourth quarter, texts with a lot of evidentials. For example, the biggest amount of evidentials contained in the Blackwellische Kräuterbuch, this translation of the herbology by Elizabeth Blackwell, containing 295 evidentials, which is quite a lot. And if we just have a look at the text individuals contained in these quarters, it is already interesting, because we could mention that in the first quarter, so text containing few evidentials, we have a lot of text from the 17th century, among them the Alchemistische Praktik, the alchemistic tractate, which is a very long text and does not contain one single evidential. And when we'll have a look at the fourth quarter, so the text containing a lot of evidentials, we have the text from the early period covered by the corpus. So the period where the scholastic tradition was dominating as an epistemological tradition. And we have also texts from the 18th century. So texts written in the context of the Enlightenment. And the other text of interest is also Alchemistische Praktik, but this is the prologue to the Alchemistische Praktik. So we have some kind of outsourcing evidentials to the prologue, where everything about evidentials and the evidential approach is written, and then no evidentials in the main text. So this is the first observation that might be a hint that, in fact, discourse traditions are somehow reflected by the use of a linguistic function. We have also the new Kräuterbuch, the Neues Kräuterbuch by Leonhard Fuchs in the first quarter. So this is also a text with very few evidentials. And this is the text, we saw the prologue earlier. So this is really a programmatic text which contains more a focus on the non-scholastic tradition, but rather the practical medical knowledge. So we can say this is a text against the scholastic tradition. But also it is of course of interest if the different strategies change over time. And here it's a good example for the numbers being difficult with our corpus, but we can definitely say, okay, the indirect reported evidentials, which are the blue dots, are dominating over time. And yeah, if we are optimistic, we could say the amount or the proportion does not change over time. If we are pessimistic, it's just not a factor, time. So it's not so much of an interest. But what is interesting is the more linguistic structure of the evidentials. So how do they look like syntactically? And here we measured the count of the amount of evidentials containing finites. So here you can see texts or time slots with evidentials containing 100% evidentials containing a finite verb. So they are of the type Dioscorides schreibt, Galenus spricht, die Meister sprechen. And you can see that these, of course, there are outliers everywhere, but in general, they seem to decrease over time. So we're becoming evidentials very similar to our conventions of referencing, Karich das Kräuterbuch, Kapitel 13, and this is in the time of the Enlightenment. Going further, very shortly, because we're running out of time, when we have a look at the lexemes realizing those finites. So the verbal lexemes, we can group them into different semantic categories, the most frequent being in the beginning, verba dicendi, so verbs meaning to say. We have also verbs meaning to write, and as we can see, they seem the verba dicendi seem to decrease and verba scribendi to increase. Of course, keeping in mind that the amount of finites in general decreases over time. And we have a semantic category apodeixis, which we derived from this concept by Galen to demonstrate and to show something as an evidential strategy. And this is also increasing a little bit over time, although here we have to collect further examples. Okay, I already mentioned the outsourcing of evidentiality in the prologues, and also topic might be a factor. Alchemistic texts seem to have less evidentials than other topics. And very briefly, authorities which are mentioned in the evidentials, the blue dots are the ancient persons, green dots are early modern persons cited. We can also see that there seem to be a decreasing of ancient persons being of interest at all. Okay, and this is it.
Yes, so we can come to our concluding remarks. And yeah, we'd like to, or we can state, I guess, that that evidentials still are a thing and can be observed and researched in the Regius Corpus and in early modern times. And I think we also can go with that idea that the use of evidentials reflects epistemological accounts of different discourse traditions. So we find that, and we can see on the one hand references to authorities still being a thing and being in use, but perhaps the authorities changing over time, and we have that concept of different topic traditions. And what's always interesting to look at, I think, is that in discourse on scientific standards raises the use and accumulation of evidentials as it is a meta discourse, meta topics. And yeah, I think, Gohar, if you want to go with the evidential expressions in Regius.
Yeah, just very shortly, I think the decrease of finite verbs may show something of the increase of abstract evidentiality. So the person of the authority, the ancient authority, is less present in the mind, so to say, very speculative. And the thing with the verbal lexemes, to say, write, read, may show something like a change of reception habits. So we come still from an oral tradition. It's not a scientific written tradition, but it's near scientific oral tradition, and this seems to change over time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then and yeah, it's just behind you. Yeah.
Oral tradition, yeah, very cautiously to say, it means, first of all, the information written down comes from an oral tradition, and the people reading those books were not the scientific community, but rather people being in the beginning of read books. So it was the very first time to books being available to a larger community. So I think it was still a new thing to have those books in your head and read by yourself in quiet. We have a lot of indications that they still read it aloud, and it was a very long period till they, yeah, that was normal to just take a book and read it by yourself. I think that I meant by oral tradition. So people were still not used to this kind of reception habit. Yeah.
Richard?
Well, just to follow on from that, this is more from an English translation from a German midwifery text, that they had a recent article about how they think it actually was read out in the original. I don't know if the original German would have been, but the English translation, so there was actually some work on Hungary. I mean, again, I don't know about the German status of that. My question, though, what did you do with items? Because I mean, there's some items that seem like they can indicate observation or visual evidence, but at the same time, some inference derived from like CHIMED or sehen in certain contexts, where it seems like you have direct observation and then the subsequent inference going on in the same verb or word. So I don't know how would you did you classify them?
We had such cases, in fact.
Yeah, I think so. We were always discussing, especially so the whole group of cases, not on the first view belonging to one or the other category. So we discussed these and tried to decide whether there is more abstract or more generalized conclusion that is deducted from that, or if it's really a punctual case of observation or instantiation of a visual act or something. So that was a case-to-case decision.
Yeah, so functional claims or evidentials don't come by themselves. They're always bound to a factual claim, and the nature of the factual claim is also the indication for the typology.
Thank you very much for your interest in interesting topic and for your talk. But I've got also, as Richard said, many questions concerning this use of the experience of devices. It's weird for me because my experience with studying the evidentials, especially with this, what you said about that did not change the type of sign. My experience that and this in English, it will change. And that depends on context, the social position, even the gender of the writer, and also the availability of material they have. Also, I've got so I don't know whether you are focusing basically on evidential meaning attribution or grammatically encoded evidential units, because I know I can also say there is no grammatical evidential in the European language. I do disagree, right? Because I think that's what I disagree, but Bayern Hart has said before me, and I'll say that there is an evidential substance including modal
verbs.
Effective, for instance. Research into this. And also, if you have find a experience and devices that may be indicative of some evidence. Sorry.
Yeah.
Big question.
We do agree that there is like a line between more lexical and more grammatical devices. So the modal verbs and specific constructions being rather at the grammatical end of the line, and we had such cases too in the text. So, Gohar, you remember the examples?
First of all, we have to say we had a variationist approach. So we annotated all the evidentials by function, deduced from the context. So it was not based on the form, and we had criteria applying to those. Let's find it now. Here they were. So we had 4 criteria what should be regarded as evidential, but of course there were ambiguous cases. For example, with sollen a lot. So German, I have this maybe political not correct sentence. Die Zigeuner sollen mit diesem Kraut ihre Haare färben. So
they are said to be coloring their hair. So this is a modal verb. Firstly, deontic, I'd say. So they shall or should, and this takes a meaning they are said to be.
But in this specific context. So we really did read all the texts and define the context and taking into account all the co-text also.
Myself, one comment. I found the result with the ultra-mischief praktik very interesting on methodological ground. Might be one that we did with Michael many years ago. I've got a lot of sympathy with the view that the text shouldn't be ignored in the structural unit in register analysis. When Jesse and Berg say that, I think, yeah. But I always think to myself that there is structure below the level of text, and that might actually be used in various ways. The reason I mentioned that, we did a wonderful project with Michael Hurry many years ago, which I think I've told you, I think it's the beginning, middle and end project, where they divided text into beginnings, middle and end, and saw newspaper text, and saw quite different functions there. And you're showing it there with the archives of practique. I'm quite tempted to say what the function there was. I think they're duping the readers by saying that they've got the evidentials up front and then never having them in the text. So it's actually reminding me again something you said yesterday about titles, where titles, and in this case, a prologue can give a horizon of expectation, which is then violated within the text, because there's no evidence at all for any of this number jumbo, I suppose. So I found that where you're using text structure, maintaining a functional focus, and there's a strong text linguistic argument for breaking the text up that way. To be very persuasive, and that to be a good but friendly and compatible counterexample to the view that you should look at the whole text. Where you've got a good example there where there is structure below the level of the text, which is being used with the discourse purpose. Deception, actually, I think is probably. So I love.
Thank you so much for and thank you for your question.
I would even go further and subdivide the chapters.
Yes, absolutely, I would too. And as they showed you their study, sometimes where you don't see it structurally, so what's happening at the beginning of a coherent unit in the text might be very different from what's happening at the end. So even within the chapters, we can think of trivial examples like, so an introduction will have certain types of language, a conclusion will have certain types of language.
Move analysis, like, spells is like moves.
Moves.
Like
to Jesse's speech, we're looking at that at the moment of trying to bulk it into sort of meaningful textual units. But a fascinating example of discourse analysis, hugely misleading prologue probably from the alchemists. Anyway, so alchemy of lunch next. But thank you very much again. Such an interesting talk.
Thank you.